Well, Happy New Year, friends. This is Matthew Sewell, and you're listening to episode 113 of the Popecast, A History of the Papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non boring stories on the successors of St. Peter and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. My guest this week is a medieval history professor by day and a world class meme lord over on Instagram by earlier in the day, as you'll hear in a bit. I'll explain what I mean by that. But his aren't the dime a dozen meme slop that can clog up so many feeds nowadays. No, Dr. Matt Ponesse instead uses marginalia from ancient manuscripts, those little doodles that are off to the side of the text itself, sometimes inappropriate, even to modern sensibilities, sometimes just kind of odd and always hilarious when seen through 21st century eyes. So make sure to stick around for that topic at the end of the episode. But in the interim, several pivotal popes from the early Middle Ages, some stories that you probably are familiar with, but told kind of from a different perspective, filling in some different details and things. Those make an appearance. And as always, there are many striking connections to our present day, more than any of us realize. So really quickly before we get into the episode, huge thank you to all the newest subscribers over on Substack. If you haven't connected over there yet, that's one of the main ways you can ensure that the Popecast is around long into the future. So head to popes.substack.com. That's popes.substack.com to make sure you get all of our free emails. So we make announcements for new episodes. Then we also have our Today in Papal History newsletter. And you can also support the show with a monthly or yearly gift to boot at that site. So that's popes.substack.com. The other way that is the biggest way that you can help keep the Popecast going is by subscribing to our YouTube channel. The larger that subscriber base gets, the more people are likely to find it and bring to the masses the great peace of knowing that we're not unique in our modern struggles. So be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and maybe even send it to a friend. Thank you in advance, and we're glad you're here. Now on to the show. Well, welcome back to the Popecast. Dr. Matt Ponesse is my guest. He's a professor of history at Ohio Dominican University. I forgot to ask what city it's in Ohio. There's so many.
Columbus, Ohio. It's
Okay.
right here in the middle of the state. Not geographically quite the middle. I think there is a town. It might even be called Centerville, but that is dead in the center of the state. But Columbus isn't that far away. It's state capital, and I'm a city slicker. I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, and I'm used to so I'm used to capital cities. Where there's a lot of government, a lot of education, a lot of healthcare. But what's two other things I'm going to say that are very similar between Columbus and where I grew up in Toronto. One, these cities are so completely flat. I will go and visit, the West Coast, or I'll go even, go over to Pittsburgh or something. And I cannot deal with mountains and hills just sort of, looming over me and upsetting my sense of direction. So yeah, it's a very, very, very flat city. And the only other thing is Columbus was one of the very first U.S. cities to have Tim Hortons. It's a donut franchise that's known in Canada. Well, not just known in Canada. It's kind of the central institution in some respect. So yeah, when I first came to Columbus, Ohio, I felt very comfortable. I was in a city that I could live in. So,
All right. So part of your lore 100 years from now, when people discover your memes but can't find any other biographical information, they'll say, oh, he was from Canada. Columbus had the first Tim Hortons, so that must be
that's
why
right.
he
Yeah,
ended up in
yeah.
Columbus,
And
Ohio.
I'm very uh, I'm very concerned that all of the information that I may communicate is authentic and is correct, and that I'm not spreading any misinformation around. But at least on those two things, I think I'm correct about that. Buffalo, New York had Tim Hortons only because of the proximity to Toronto. But then you didn't want to hear any of this. This is not why I'm here.
Hey,
But
find my meme.
but you know what? The actual reason that I was led to believe was that Columbus, or kind of a suburb of Columbus, Dublin, Ohio, that's where the headquarters of Wendy's International is, the Wendy's
Really?
hamburger chain. And up in Canada, Wendy's and Tim Hortons kind of formed this, you know, cooperative, this union. They joined forces up in Canada, and I think that's why they brought Tim Hortons down here to kind of serve as a test market. So
That makes perfect
again,
sense.
I hope that's accurate. I really hope I'm not just making this up. So
Well, maybe that's a good segue into the topic I was hoping to talk about because so often history is suggested or history is written by the victors, as they say. I mean, I think that's probably largely true,
yeah, yeah,
um,
I'm not
but I
gonna.
mean, we could go with that. So yeah, maybe you could share a little bit of your background first, what you like to teach on. We had a bit of a conversation before, but for those listening, for kind of the specialties, and then we'll
Yeah,
focus in hopefully more on the Great Schism today of 1054. We're
sure,
approaching exactly 1,000 years when that officially happened. But again,
right.
history is kind of strange. There was a lot that went into that before they, so-called schism in that year. But yeah, what's a little bit of your background and
Well,
teaching interest and that sort of thing?
I'm going to take you back to graduate school for um, for two reasons. It is kind of my academic background. That's kind of where it was formed and shaped, but it's also going to relate to the schism and why perhaps I shouldn't be the one even talking about it. Um, but when I was in graduate school, uh, and even doing my undergraduate degree, and I realized that maybe law school wasn't the thing for me, and there's only this one type of discipline I'm doing well at academically, and that's history courses. Maybe I could do history for a living. And when I figured out that it was possible to do that, I had my heart set on late antiquity. I loved the imperial period of Rome. I and but more specifically, late antiquity, fourth century, and the church. That is, I loved ecclesiastical history, and really, this is where I wanted to focus. And I remember talking to a professor at the time, said, "Well, what would your focus be, if you did history?" And I said, "Well, this is the period I love, late antiquity." And they asked, "Well, how's your Greek?" And I said, It's non-existent." And they said, "You are not doing late antiquity." "How's your Latin?" And I said, "Well, it's marginally, there is a little bit of it there." And they're like, "You're gonna, you need to advance. Just, leave late antiquity behind. You're studying medieval history. You're studying Western history of medieval Europe." And that's kind of, the direction I was pushed into. So I'm not saying I was reluctant to move from this period, but I've always had a fondness for it. And I've always had a fondness for ecclesiastical history. And then in graduate school, I went to it's a academic department called the Center for Medieval Studies at Toronto. And there is some affiliation with the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies that's there. Um, but at the Center for Medieval Studies, I remember it's an interdisciplinary department, and they said, "Well, what do you want to study?" And I said, "Well, I'm interested in literature. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in religion, theology." And they said, "Well, pick one." And I said, "Why? I'm at an interdisciplinary department. I'll get my PhD in medieval studies." And they said, "But you're never going to get hired in a center for medieval studies. There aren't enough of them. You're either going to be hired in a literature department, in a history department." And so I had to commit to history, even though, again, I loved theology, I loved philosophy. Um, and so I really, my approach, so not only am I chronologically now in the early Middle Ages, but my approach is as a historian, but it's an intellectual historian. I love the history of ideas, I love the history of institutions, and I'm really not good at dotting the i's and crossing the t's, detailed oriented history. So when you ask me, come on and let's talk about the popes, I got a sense of dread because, I'm like, I this is the most detailed oriented subject you can get. What number is it again? Which Leo is it again? Which, is it the third? Is it the first? Is it, um So, I'll do my best. But again, I really do love, very large ideas that kind of connect history together. And focus mainly on the early Middle Ages. And if you want to be more specific than that, I study ninth century intellectual history and the writings of intellectuals in Carolingian France, and
Hmm.
how they received kind of the inheritance from the past, how they took this body of patristic literature and how they reworked it for their own generation. So that's kind of one of my focuses. Another focus that relates to that is early medieval monasticism, simply because a lot of the scholars that I focused on tended to be Benedictines, tended to be abbots, and so I've really developed a passion for medieval monasticism, researching it and teaching it. And lastly, and this is sort of a new focus of mine, and this has a lot to do with being at a teaching oriented university. Ohio Dominican is a liberal arts university, very, very small. Um, and the priority is on teaching. We're expected to do research, we're expected to publish, but really the priority is in the classroom and engaging with students and connecting with students and being dynamic. And a lot of my research focuses on teaching texts, texts that were written for students at a monastery. And some of these writings have fascinating, fascinating little anecdotes about the reason why these authors are even beginning to write a new commentary. They have to justify their project. Why are they writing a new commentary on the Gospel of John when Augustine wrote a good one? Are you better than Augustine? Are you saying Augustine, you know, it needs to be sort of pushed aside to make room for this new ninth century treatise? So there's a lot of justifications for the writing of these commentaries, and and it's so fascinating when these authors reveal something about the classroom, reveal something about their students just not getting it, their students not being able to memorize something. So their students writing down, taking notes furiously. Um, and it made me really intrigued by what is going on in the medieval classroom. So right now, my project is looking at education, not just in the ninth century, but I'm which where education is slightly more formalized, but in the murkier centuries that lead up to the ninth century, I'm looking at kind of monastic education through the lives of saints, through the lives of very, very obscure um, monks and abbots that lived anywhere between 500 and 900 AD. So that is a big sweeping answer to your question. What is my focus? But I think I've covered it all.
Yeah, that's pretty good. It also gives a little bit of a teaser for the end of our conversation that we'll of course make sure to get to how you're kind of Instagram famous, if you will. I now understand how you find all these little rabbits and funny looking tropical animals that people didn't actually know what they look like, and
Right.
butts for some reason, and all these other things that you make your memes out of that are amazing. Um, and I guess I realize I'm also remiss, and I assume you probably have read quite a bit of Gregory the Great then as well, considering he's one of the fathers, if you will, of monasticism, having been such a devotee of Saint Benedict, right?
Right. Well, there's a very famous quote about ninth century uh, Christian writing, and it says the scholar said to understand the Carolingians is simply to understand their sources. By the way, I don't agree with that. They're not just derivative. They are very innovative in how they rework their material. But I am going to use that to at least say, well, I've read Gregory the Great, sort of, simply because I've read a lot of Gregory the Great through the writings of the ninth century.
Mhm.
So a lot of the word florilegium, florilegia are these compendiums of knowledge that contain the extracts of the fathers. And the word florilegium, it literally implies picking the best fruit, picking the flowers, in the field. So what these ninth century scholars did was they went back to this tradition, this wealth of and they viewed themselves as intellectually impoverished. They saw themselves almost as beggars, that were coming to the fields after the harvesters have already picked everything. And
Wow.
there's just leftovers. And these ninth century scholars, this is their intellectual humility. Um, these ninth century scholars are just picking up the remnants that have been left over for their age. Well, so Gregory the Great, it's very rare that I'll sit down, and open up, an authentic. This is the 3-volume commentary on the Moralia, the Book of Job, or however many volumes. It's probably a lot more than that.
Right.
I can't say I've ever done that, but I have read what is alleged to be the best of Gregory the Great through these compilers. So,
Okay.
um, and I
Yeah.
teach about Gregory the Great, specifically a lot of his evangelization to Northern Europe and how he kind of rekindled that movement, especially sending kind of ambassadors and emissaries to Britain. So no, he's definitely a favorite of mine, and there's lots of Gregorys in my family, and all of the Gregorys take their name from Pope Gregory the First. So
Wow, that's incredible. I have one of my sons is named Gregory after Saint Gregory the Great,
oh,
but
no
he's the
kidding.
one. He's the one and only. I think my father-in-law has a first cousin or something who's
I see.
Greg, but that's about all. That's about all.
Right, right.
But yeah, at any rate, I was sorry. That was kind of off topic, but I was curious. That's interesting to know. So it's funny you mentioned the intellectual poverty because we talked before we started recording about how we both like making these connections between present day and the past. One of the reasons I love the 11th century in particular, but also that kind of middling period of what people will call the Dark Ages, pretend like Christendom, the Catholic Church didn't, lay all of this groundwork for what we now enjoy, and maybe are overseeing the the destruction of, depending on who you ask. But this connection between the past and the present, and the errors of the past
Mm,
that precipitated these, barbarian invasions or the falls of these great civilizations, seemed to be an intellectual pride. Would you agree that, like,
mm.
where the monks seem to be, where the best fruit ended up coming from, and maybe where the seeds of restoration ended up coming from, wasn't intellectual poverty and a not forgetting that we're not the smartest ones who have ever lived, but in fact the smartest, there's way smarter people who have lived before us. We should find what they did that ensured the flourishing of
So are you
civilization or
saying
whatever.
from our perspective and viewpoint now, or kind of somewhere in the middle of the Middle Ages?
Yeah, well, I guess both. So I mean, you're saying that these monasteries were treating themselves as being intellectually poor, which led them to look to the past
Mhm.
to teach them how to live in the present. And I'm saying in the present, it seems like so
Yes.
often you look on the news, almost anywhere, we are the smartest,
Yeah.
we are the most advanced. Far be it from us to look to the past. We don't even think of G.K. Chesterton's Democracy of the Dead.
Absolutely. In fact, I teach at a very small university, which means I'm responsible for more than the Middle Ages. So occasionally I teach the early modern period as well, up to the Enlightenment. And prior to, well, arguments can be made for certain periods during the Renaissance, but leading up to the Enlightenment, we start having this very new idea that maybe things aren't getting worse. Maybe we're not getting worse as a civilization. Maybe, in fact, we're building on, like, and this is actually a medieval notion. I think it's a quote found in John of Salisbury, who's a scholastic, but he's very famous for uttering the phrase, "We are like dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants." In fact, if you there's something on the internet, I think it's still there, called Google Scholar, and if you go to this kind of filtered search engine, right underneath the bar where you put in your search query is that quote. We are
I've seen that before.
you know,
Yeah.
we are, um, I think it's just standing on the shoulders of giants. Um, but we're starting, but that the implication, yes, is that we're smaller than the people in the past, but that because of the vantage they give us, because we're building on their accomplishments, we are reaching farther and seeing, reaching higher and seeing farther. So um, we're starting to see that development in the later Middle Ages, but then in the early modern period, we have this notion of progress that, wait a second, we're not getting worse, we're getting better and better. It's the best of all possible worlds that, um, so this confidence, this pride, call it hubris if you want. There's lot of literature that tries to push back against this. Even Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's this kind of cautionary Promethean tale. That
Hmm.
maybe we do need more humility. Maybe just because we can doesn't mean we should. So as a historian of the early Middle Ages, I'm I find it almost repugnant that we don't approach things with a little more humility and caution. That 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 there are ideas that are time tested. History is a great tool for assessing the utility of ideas and for giving us we shouldn't have to go through the world using trial and error. That we have history as a guide. We shouldn't do it because it's dictating a certain path for us, but we should at least expose ourselves to the ideas of history and get a little more insight before we go into something blind. So no, definitely I am very much influenced by the subject matter that I've studied. And I do see it as a valuable perspective that, the world needs. So,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah. I'll delete this if you haven't read it, but have you read A Canticle for Leibowitz?
yeah, um, I'm I'm impressed that my eldest son, who's in college right now, has been pressing me to read this.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, oh yeah, he has been
Ooh.
pressing me, and so much so that it is on my nightstand. And this is a horrible thing for me to admit, but at night, I will pick it up, I will open the first page, and I'm asleep by the time I get to the bottom, and that is not in any way to suggest that this book is not captivating. It's simply my body has conditioned myself to, when I begin to read something for pleasure, that's the one that you just everything shuts down and you go to
Yeah.
sleep. So, hopefully over the holidays, that's actually the next one, on the stack that I'm planning on reading, because
Okay.
you see so much similarity between what I'm studying, and
Hmm.
its content. So, tell me a little bit,
Well, yeah.
what
So, and yeah, for any listeners who haven't heard of it, let alone read it, highly recommend. But it was written in the '60s, I think, but it's basically a kind of an example of what we've been talking about, where society got so advanced, nuclear war happened, society destroyed itself, and then now you have these monks in this desolate, deserted wasteland of what you gather to be America. And there's, I think they call it New Rome, like the Vatican somehow has been reestablished in America because Europe got destroyed, or whatever it was. It's very cryptic about it all. But the point was that monasteries rebuild civilization, and it's three little miniature books, or three acts, I guess, if you want to say, that the book is comprised of. And so it's uh I think a couple hundred years after the nuclear winter,
Mhm.
and then 600 years later, and then 1200 years after that. And so the second book, not to spoil anything, but the second book, they start to develop electricity. And the third book, they're basically back to where we were, like as far as an advanced technological civilization.
Hmm,
So it's a fascinating, completely fiction.
right.
The author, I think, I was talking to a priest friend who told me this. I didn't know this before I had read it, but he was a bomber pilot in World War II, and I think was part of the gaggle of airplanes. That's not the name of it. I don't know. I forget the
I
the unit that.
like the visual, though.
Oh yeah, right. But it was part of the unit that bombed Monte Cassino, I think, in
And
World War II, and he was so torn apart by that society had reached that point that it inspired him to write this book.
you're
But
kidding.
anyways,
Well,
Yeah.
no, I not to keep going on, where we're I I love some of these tangents a lot. It was only recently that I was looking for a picture. This is sort of an Instagram related thing, but I was looking for pictures of monasteries, and of course, a thought occurred to me, just a random thought. I said, "Oh well, let's look at Monte Cassino," and I looked at Monte Cassino, and it's the heart, the center of Benedictine monasticism, um, a lot of uh, when I say a lot of my research, because I'm interested in Benedictine monasticism specifically, because the scholars I look at tend to be Benedictine monks and abbots. Monte Cassino holds such a high place. It's very close to my heart. I've never visited, and then I saw this picture. I found this picture online. It was sort of an aerial picture of Monte Cassino, and I kind of frowned. I said, "It looks so modern." Yeah, I mean, because when you're looking at it, especially an aerial picture, it just looks square, or at least it's surrounded by walls. I mean, it's a monastery, it should be cloistered. But, in my mind, I've gone to Ireland, I've seen these like beautiful ruins of Cistercian monasteries, they're just so idyllic, and, you lament their destruction during the dissolution period. But Monte Cassino, it's still active,
Hmm.
but it does not at any rate in any way look medieval or ancient. Um, and of course, that led me to the bombing at the end of World War II, and then I started hunting down pictures of what it would have looked like prior to the its utter destruction. It looks identical. It looks like
Yeah. Right.
they rebuilt this, and so I'm surprised, like, when I look at a modern picture of Monte Cassino, I'm about to lament, you know, modern architectural aesthetics, "Oh, what are they doing? Can't we, sustain some of these, the Gothic and Romanesque, architectural, styles? Why does everything have to be, just so whitewashed and so flat and so." But no, this was the monastery. They rebuilt it. That's to my knowledge. It was only
Hmm.
it wasn't a very deep rabbit hole I went down, because I didn't have that much time that day. But
Right.
you mentioned Monte Cassino, because I was just looking into that, and we have certain ideas of the past that you know everything is going to look a certain way, but the fact that this building, you know, looks today very much like it would have looked in the 19th century is intriguing. But and
Yeah.
that is how connected the people were to this place, and how they were just gutted after World War II to see its destruction. So
Hmm. Yeah, understandably so. Well, yeah, I I've enjoyed these little tangents too. But I guess to go back to and this has been great. I mean, the tangents I think can make the conversation sometimes, but yeah, to maybe put a little finer point on or to hone in on a specific era. So the Great Schism happened in 1054, but your intellectual interest, especially being the ninth century, what was kind of going on as far as you're aware, or as far as you've seen and observed, that started to precipitate the church splintering like that between East and West? Obviously, there was the geographic realities. It's hard to get from Rome to Constantinople. Roman Empire was gone. Now it was the empire was seated in the East and all these things. But as far as intellectual history, maybe some of the heresies or um, leaders. The Pope was always kind of at odds with the Exarch of Ravenna and all this drama. So I mean, as far as from a 30,000 foot view, as you've said, which I also appreciate, not being
yeah.
super interested in dotting i's and crossing t's, but as far as trends go, but what was sort of I guess bubbling 200 years before that happened that eventually led to it?
Yeah. You'll hate me for even a more elevated kind of vantage, but being an early medieval historian, And even somebody who tries to pretend to be a little bit of a late antique historian, the first kind of, I won't call it a catalyst, is that the but the relationship of the Roman pontiff to the Eastern patriarchs has always been tense, and there's always been a debate about papal primacy. In fact, you can't even call it a debate because it wasn't even acknowledged. When you're talking about the fourth and fifth centuries and the great period of the ecumenical councils, um, the Pope was barely, well, first of all, the Pope wasn't invited to, the majority of them. The Pope was in this, it's funny to call Rome the backwater of the Roman Empire. But
Mm-hmm.
that's really what happened in the fourth century. When the Roman Empire split, and also when the Roman Empire was Christianized under Constantine, kind of the geographical center of Rome shifted to Constantinople, and and Rome actually kind of remained a hotbed of paganism. If you think of
Mm-hmm.
Augustine and Jerome, and their reactions to, some of the destruction of Rome by, under the Visigoths, etc. They're blaming it on paganism. They're blaming it on the fact that Rome hasn't fully accepted Christianity. The East is where the new project began. Constantinople was a new founded city. There was, in fact, um, I think it was Diocletian, the emperor right before Constantine. Diocletian is actually the one who split the empire, and who founded an eastern capital. But I'm trying to remember exactly the name of the city that he located his palace at. But that's not where Constantinople, or excuse me, that's not where Constantine chose his
Mm-hmm.
palace to be. He chose a brand new place. This was Christian from the start. So who is this bishop in Rome who's constantly kind of, I won't call it clamoring. I don't want to be dismissive, but who's constantly saying, listen to me, I have something to say on these issues. The Roman pontiff was mostly ignored. It was the patriarchs of Constantinople and Alexandria, and who were debating the Christology of the time. The Pope was almost an observer. And but that's not to say this is an era when papal primacy, and the Petrine doctrine weren't being developed. And there's really, really interesting kind of incidents that occur where the Pope was brought in that actually provides a foundation for the teaching of papal primacy. So right from the beginning, um, there was a split. And I think historians might offer lots of different reasons. One of the I'm going to give you the least convincing explanation of why there might have been disagreement. It's the least convincing one, but the one I'm most intrigued by, simply because I teach the Latin language, and I've heard a lot of the theological um, kind of conflicts between the East and the West over lots of over lots of theology, whether it's iconoclasm and whether it's the filioque. But I've heard it might have something to do with the fact that, well, everybody's saying the same thing. It's just we're using different languages. And Greek is a language that is much more flexible and capable of pondering abstract ideas, whereas Latin is a very formulaic and legalistic language. And so a lot of the tension between um, these two regions is a linguistic one. Um, and so I've actually delved into that question, not in relation to this kind of religious divide, but more, is there any validity to that? First of all, like, I'm really,
Mm-hmm.
when I teach Latin, my students absolutely hate it. because I am, I'm like, listen, just stick to the declensions and the conjugations, and this is just, you know, this is as um, it should be reassuring to know that there is an answer, there is a translation, there is a way to understand this sentence, and if you simply apply the grammatical rules, you will get to, the correct result. It's not vague. I'm not saying it's not capable of being beautiful and abstract, but
Hmm.
not like the Greek language, And so linguistically, there's a basis for that. There are certain elements in the Greek language that do not exist in Latin that permit, or facilitate a much more speculative understanding of theology. But and I'm not going to go into those. Although if this was a philology podcast, this would be amazing. We could talk all about it.
Do a bonus episode where you can just
Bonus,
unspool
yeah.
for 3 hours. Yeah.
Interested listeners can
Right.
spend time on. You'll have two people. At any rate, um, I believe there was an occasion in the fourth century where the Pope was wondering what was going on at an ecumenical council and got a really bad translation of it. My
Mm.
memory is not going to serve me well. I almost wonder whether it was Pope Leo the First, which occasioned his writing of the tome.
Mhm.
This official, let's just kind of this official pronouncement, ultimate pronouncement on, Christology, and that pretty much settled the whole Nestorian controversy, etc. Um, again, I don't want to. I can't say this unequivocally, but I know at least one papal response to some of the controversies that were going on in the East was occasioned by a faulty translation of the Greek. But that's really, that this only anecdote I can kind of bring forward. There are absolute legitimate disagreements, that are not just theological, that intertwine with politics as well. So iconoclasm, had as much to do with, political differences as they did with kind of theological ones. There's a controversy that, you know I only recently learned about, that, was going on around 1053, that had to do with the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist.
Wow.
Um, oh, and this is actually not a small issue going on at the time. Iconoclasm, filioque, those were big ones. The primacy of Rome, that was papal primacy, was honestly the big one, and that continues to be the big divide between the East and the West. But there was this controversy of the the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist. Apparently, the Greek Church at the time viewed the use of unleavened bread um, as almost being too Jewish, so there was a lot of uh, uh, kind of arguments being made that leavened bread should be used in Christianity because the leaven relates to kind of the rising, the resurrection, the so I only recently kind of learned about this issue, but that position was clearly motivated by more than just theology. There were,
Mhm.
there were issues in the East that were going on that were certainly influencing that kind of stipulation. Um, so no, uh, I think in the early Middle Ages, what fascinates me about the Pope is, from the vantage point of the East, the Pope was in kind of the backwater of the ecclesiastical world, and was claiming a position that the Greek patriarch simply didn't acknowledge. The only interesting thing was, and the only useful thing, um, uh, that Rome was able to kind of fill in was as an appealing kind of mechanism, which is going to bolster the assertion of papal primacy. That in a lot of these early councils, bishops were being deposed as heretics, and on some occasions, the patriarch it, allowed an appeal to be made to Rome. Well, the way Rome interpreted that was, well, if an appeal is being made, that means I'm giving the ultimate, decision of the matter. Therefore, I am not just first among equals, that some patriarchs admitted at some times, but that I am kind of I am not simply a brother among brothers, but I am the father of the church.
Mhm.
So so that's really the fourth and fifth century. The popes were kind of footnotes in ecclesiastical history, with the exception of Leo the First, who definitely stands out when Pope Leo wrote his tome. By the way, he wrote it not for the Council of Chelsea. Is it Chalcedon?
Chalcedon, yeah. Mhm.
I've had people know that word so many different times. Um, but he wrote it for the Second Council of Ephesus. And when they received it, it was unwanted, it was ignored, it wasn't even read. And it was read to exonerate two bishops who had been declared heretics. Well, and I think that was, that, was it like seven, what century am I in? It was something like 449 or something like that.
Mhm.
I think 452 might be Chalcedon. Um, I'm hoping these are dotting the i's and
Right.
the elements that I
Close enough. Yeah.
wrote. But he sent it again at Chalcedon to back another individual, back another bishop who had been deemed a heretic. And when it was read at the council, the those in attendance apparently kind of acclaimed unanimously, this is the true faith, this is this is what settled the controversies at the time. So that went a lot of way in kind of cementing, the Bishop of Rome's position, at least theologically, in the church. But after Pope Leo, then we get, excuse me, and also Pope Leo is well known, at least in the West, for his face off against Attila the Hun, which is very
Yep.
famous.
Right.
But from the Eastern perspective, that kind of was meaningless. But in the West, that was kind of it wasn't just a unifying factor. The fact that Pope Leo seems to be the only individual standing against this horde uh, is quite important. But then after Pope Leo, the papacy is kind of falls out of is no longer kind of on the radar, is not standing out. Pope Gregory the Great is known probably less in his time for his contribution. His contribution is an intellectual one. Um, you know, he definitely instituted lots of reforms that um, slowly kind of trickled down and bore such great fruit. So Pope Gregory the Great truly was great, but politically during his time, Italy was not a major player. And in fact, the Pope at the time was surrounded by heretics, the heretical barbarian kingdoms. What's really interesting in the early Middle Ages is that um, Rome was an island surrounded by heretics. You have, well, I'm not going to call the, 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 um, the Greeks heretics at the time, but there were a few cities under the direct control of Byzantium, the Eastern Emperor. Then you have, you had the Ostrogoths who were Christian, but they just adopted the wrong form. They adopted, but maybe it was a type of Arianism. But then when the Ostrogoths fell, the Lombards came in. The Lombards were heretics. The Visigoths. There was only one group of people, one barbarian kingdom that adopted the Orthodox Roman form, and that was the Franks. So that kind of leads directly into my interest in the papacy, the connection between the Pope in Rome and the Carolingian family. The Carolingian family, Rome, Rome, Rome was surrounded on all sides. The Lombards wanted Roman land, and they had to appeal to help. They had to appeal. They needed protectors, and they saw the Franks as and the Carolingian family as kind of the ideal solution. And so, and there was one thing that the Carolingians needed from the Pope at the time. So it didn't have to be a one-way sort of agreement. Um, you know, the barbarian kings were very practical. They weren't simply going to come down and protect you for no good reason. And it was very risky to do so because you made a lot of enemies if you were to befriend the Pope. Um, but the Carolingians needed something from the Pope because the Carolingians at the time, they weren't kings. They were aristocrats. They were very well positioned aristocrats, but they needed to be recognized as kings, and that is something only God can do. Only God can deign that this family, is meant to be his royal intercessor on earth. And so the popes at the time, and this is in the mid 8th century, said, "Well, you need our help to come down and protect you from a lot of these heretical groups. Um, it'd be kind of nice if you answer the question, who should rule? The family with the name of king, or the family that is actually exercising the power of king? Because this family, this Carolingian family, they were the ones actually calling all the shots, but it was this other group called the Merovingians that actually had the name of king, and so it was Pope Stephen II. There, I could be really specific.
All right, nice.
Well, it was Pope Zachary. I don't have his number. Pope Zachary was the pope who, um, I believe his name was Pepin, Carolingian, who will be King Pepin. I think he was the third or the short. I'm getting more detailed, and I'm losing my hold on it. Um, but he went to Pope Zachary with that question, saying, who should rule? Should it be the family with the name of king, or the family that's actually upholding the duty of king? And Pope Zachary said, "Oh, well, the family upholding the duties of king are the true kings of France." And that was essentially declaring the Carolingian family as the new dynasty. And it needed to be cemented, and Pope Zachary dies. Pope Stephen II takes over, and um, he kind of permits. I don't think it was Pope Stephen II who presided over the coronation. I think it was actually Boniface, but he authorizes that the Carolingian family should be the next family to rule. So, and the Pope declares the Franks, this new dynasty, declares them patricians of Rome and gives them the responsibility. And it's very prudent for him to do so. And he kind of, ties the ties the future of the papacy to this family to a very good effect, because then, and we'll get to schisms in a second, but then by the end of the 8th century, we have a pope called Pope Leo III. Pope Leo III, it's not that he was a weak pope, but he had a lot of enemies. He had a lot of people who disagreed with his election. I believe there might have even been concerns that he wasn't of aristocratic blood, and so there were a lot of prominent Roman families that didn't believe that he should be the ruler. And one day, and this is kind of, I'll say it's leading up to Christmas, uh, 800 AD. Um, he's surrounded by a mob, and he's beaten up. In fact, he's not beaten up. This is almost an assassination attempt. They attempt to pluck out his eyes, tear out his tongue. These are
Mhm.
injuries that would have resulted in somebody's death. But he miraculously survives. And in fact, he was saved by the new king of the Franks at the time. The king of the Franks was Charlemagne, or Charles the Great.
Mhm.
It was his ambassadors who find him lying bloody on the street, and they send word to Charlemagne, and Charlemagne comes down, He finds the perpetrators of this crime, brings them to justice. And then, since he's there, he's asked, well, do you want to spend Christmas in Rome? It's 800 AD. It's a very easy date. This is like the second of two dates that I've memorized as a history. Christmas Day, 800 AD. Charlemagne goes into the Lateran, I believe, to pray. And I believe, at least in one source, it says that when he gets up from praying in prayer, that the Pope Leo III, is there with a crown and crowns him Emperor of Europe. And again, there's lots of scholarship written on this. It used to be quite the subject, that interested historians in the mid 20th century. Can't believe I'm saying that as if it's a long, long time ago. I guess it is. But
75 years now, right?
but the significance of a pope, this does in a lot of ways kind of relate the weakness of the pope at the time, that the pope had to connect himself with a protector, and in the coronation put himself above, Charlemagne, spiritually, as the one who's doing the crowning. And Charlemagne, was not a nominal Christian. Charlemagne, I'm not saying he doesn't have his conquests and doesn't have his acts of brutality, but very much saw his role as to safeguard the church and Christians, and to kind of elevate people, and to give them the best chance at achieving their salvation through their life on earth. And so he, while being called emperor, didn't really, do a whole lot more for him than he had already done by himself. It does cement the relationship of the papacy in this family. And it was right in the 9th century that we start having a lot of a renewal, not a renewal, but we start seeing ecclesiastical controversies rearing their ugly head again. And it's precisely at this time we have iconoclasm, in the 8th century. In the 9th century, we have a lot of kind of Eucharistic controversies, a return to exactly what's going on here. Is the Eucharist a symbol, or is the Eucharist, substantially, the body and blood of Christ? But then we also have the very famous filioque controversy. And so this is now I could at least say I've connected with 1054, right? 1054, the Great Schism.
The second date that you've memorized, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm done. I'm done. Don't expect any more. So we have the filioque controversy, and what's so interesting, when I started my dissertation, when I was doing my PhD program, I was hoping. I had an advisor at the time, very famous historian, um, and my advisor kept saying, "So, do you have a topic? Do you have an idea? Have you identified a problem for your?" This is very much in the early stages of my dissertation, and I had no idea how to come about a problem. And I said, "Well, how did you do it?" And my advisor told me, "Oh, well, my own advisor just said, here, this needs to be done, do it." And I'm like, "Oh, that's great. So are you going to do the same to me?" And he said, "No, I had to do it by myself." So, I was just looking at all these 9th century authors, and I came across the strangest name. I almost don't even want to say it, but it is the subject of my dissertation. His name was Abbot Smaragdus, was his name. Abbot
What a name.
Smaragdus. He was an abbot of a Benedictine monastery in northeastern France, very, very close to Verdun. Um, and and the name intrigued me, and it means emerald in both Greek and Latin,
Okay.
for what it's worth. But I was interested in what he wrote, because this guy was a footnote, and to me, I was looking for obscure topics to write my dissertation on. And the fact that this guy was a footnote, but not talked about anymore in the body of anyone's discussion, that's kind of a lead. Well, it turns out he wrote the first commentary on the Rule of Saint Benedict. I'm like, wow, that's
Whoa.
pretty big. And then he wrote commentaries on the Psalms. I'm like, all right, commentaries on the Psalms. Oh, he wrote a commentary on an old Roman grammar. And I'm like, hey, I love grammar. I teach Latin. Well, that's good. Um, oh, he wrote a book of advice for a Carolingian king. I'm like, that's regarded as the first political treatise written in the Western tradition, Western Christian tradition. I'm like, huh? He wrote all this? And then the last thing he wrote the official Carolingian ninth century defense of the Filioque. And he wrote it as a defense, not to the Eastern Church, but to Rome. He
Wow.
it, he wrote it, I think it was Pope Hadrian or what? No, it couldn't have been. Well, he wrote it addressed it to Rome, defending the Frankish incorporation of the Filioque into the Nicene Creed. And I'm like, this guy, how has he written so much and no one mentions him? And then it turns out that, well, when you read his treatise on the procession of the Holy Spirit, well, Augustine says, well, Jerome says, Pope Gregory was known to have said, the Venerable Bede says, you know, it's all simple. Oh, and of course, he doesn't start with the patristics. He starts with scripture. Well, it says in Romans, it says in this, it says in that. There is not one line of original theological, you know, writing in this text. It is simply quote to quote to quote to quote to quote, which is why people just dismissed it. Well, turns out that kind of makes for a very substantial defense of the the procession of the Holy Spirit. So at any rate, I do have a pretty intimate connection to this debate. Not that I was focused at all on that particular treatise, but I had to learn a little bit about what was going on in the history of the church and what was going on in the ninth century. Well, of course, I'm assuming, well, Pope Leo was just in the news visiting Lebanon and Turkey. And I guess there was a controversial moment, and modern popes are not without controversial moments. Well, there was a controversial moment that at one of the liturgies, Pope Leo was reciting. And of course, I think one of the reasons for this whole visit was it was the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. So
1700 years, yeah.
this is such a 325, right? Well, there's a third date. There's a third date.
Bonus date.
So at any rate, on the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, where we have this most famous elevator speech for all Christians, everyone's listening to, the Patriarch of Constantinople. I call it Constantinople. I don't know the name of the patriarch.
I think he still does go by Patriarch of Constantinople.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's modern history, so I'm second guessing.
Right.
And Pope Leo are saying it together, and everyone is just listening, because the Nicene Creed does not include "and the Son." I believe in the Holy Spirit, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. The original Nicene Creed is "who proceeds from the Father." And then next clause.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I guess the controversy that I'm going to let lots of better and more informed people discuss is what Pope Leo did not say "and the Son." And what does that imply? Well, this is I'm not kind of well, I'm happy to be an apologist. I'm a Roman Catholic, an apologist for Pope Leo. But in the history of the Western Church, from 400 AD to at least 800 AD, the Filioque was mostly not said, but it was understood. That was how it was handled in the church in the West. That this eternal procession. I think I'm getting that language right. The controversy and the distinction between the East and the West. I'm not a theologian, but the controversy is with regard to whether the Holy Spirit precedes eternally from both the Father and the Son, and the Eastern The Eastern theology does not permit that eternal procession can only be from the Father, um, and that it may happen through the Son. That's probably very loose language, but that in the Roman Catholic tradition, that the procession is from both, hence filioque and the Son. Um, well, in the ninth century, there was in Jerusalem. I think it was like 807, maybe 808. There were two monasteries in Jerusalem. One had Greek monks and one had Western Benedictine monks. And the Greek monks approached the Western Benedictine monks and started getting angry at them because they were saying filioque. And they said, that is absolutely not permitted. That gets back to the West. And the Pope at the time said, no, we don't say it, but it's understood. It's fine, but we're not going to formally include it in the Western Rite. And the Frankish Church got all up in arms, said that's ridiculous. And I think the Charlemagne at the time was, some scholars have said he was looking for excuses to kind of have differences with the East. I don't know exactly how true that is. But Charlemagne decided that he wanted to commission a formal defense of the filioque and appealed to Rome and said this needs to be formally included. And so we have not just the treatise written by the scholar that I studied for my dissertation, but by a number of intellectuals in the ninth century, all writing treatises defending the inclusion of the filioque. I don't believe the Pope ever did in the ninth century include it. In fact, I think the formal inclusion might have been 1054. I can't be certain about that. So at any rate, that is the extent of my understanding of the theological divide over the filioque in the early Middle Ages. But this last point, that the Pope never formally includes it, despite everything I've said about the Pope being a rather kind of weak official. Here's the Pope in the ninth century kind of needing a king to come down and protect him from a mob, and needing to kind of utilize this, this family to to elevate his own position, etc. um it's interesting that Rome did that. This was kind of the this was the one kind of hill that the Pope was just going to, I won't say die on, but stand on, and defend that the filioque wasn't going to be introduced, and that it would take several centuries before it was formally included. So that I'll let you kind of, if there's any questions you have about that, or any challenges, because I'm sure I'm not getting everything right. Um, before we get to 1054 specifically.
No, I think that's pretty fascinating. The a quick sidebar, just I thought you were going to go to the third secret of Fatima with the Pope dying on a hill. No, just kidding.
Oh.
That's kind of a deep track. We don't have to go there. No, I think that's really interesting, particularly how it's never occurred to me before. Like in the full flowering of history, you're right. You look back and the popes listened to for a time and not for a time, and then Constantinople's doing what they want, and all these varying kingdoms do, but they always come back. It's like that line from Evil and Wise, it in Brideshead Revisited, that the Lord can draw you back with a twitch upon the thread. I think Chesterton quotes that in Father Brown too. That it's kind of this allegory for, one, the story of Jesus and salvation history, that God gives us the freedom to do what we want, but then eventually, if we're smart, we keep coming back to the source. So Peter being the source that Jesus left for the church, and that being the theory. And then just in normal life, I have 3 small children, and how often do I say, "Don't do that"? The oldest is 6, and then he does the thing, tears, anguish, whatever, and then they come
Hmm.
back. I told you not to do the thing, right? It's
Right.
like this little allegory. It's like the Pope is almost this figurehead where um it's kind of this mirroring of normal life. I mean, for what that's worth, it's not super related to what we're talking about specifically, but I just had that kind of interesting observation. I don't know if you see that too.
But it's funny you say, um, I guess when you study medieval history, um, well, let me approach it this way. I mean, we're all armchair quarterbacks and popes. We're all more Catholic than the Pope. And then of course our current age, the Pope's every action is just being every statement, every utterance, every glance is just being, you know, scrutinized by everybody. What does this mean? Um, and this expectation, that the Pope is going to be infallible in every single matter. Well, you know, doctrinally, you know, that's what you should expect doctrinally. Um, but on everything else, sure, I don't want the Pope to be vague, and sure, I don't want the Pope to send mixed messages, and sure, I don't want scandals to be caused. And I'm not talking, about modern papacy. I'm talking about the papacy, throughout
Right.
history. But when you study the medieval papacy, maybe you are you at least have a perspective where you can expect the Pope to falter, where you could expect the Pope to behave in different ways. And I forget who said it, but the notion that the church has survived despite some of the things that has been done by the
Hmm.
papacy is evidence of God's existence and God's um, glory. um, the medieval papacy has not been perfect. We started talking about monks and pride, and it might have been, is it Gregory the Seventh? It's those numbers, and I only see Roman numerals. Um, it's 511. No. Um, is it Gregory the Seventh in the investiture controversy?
Yep.
Um, But one of the first of all, all it takes is a controversy to just that's where all the dirty laundry gets aired.
Right. Yeah.
No, it's like a divorce proceeding. Or it's like a celebrity breakup. One's sorry for the analogies, but celebrities breaking up, then you hear all sorts of things that were going on behind closed doors that you'd rather not hear.
Hmm.
Well, there in the Middle Ages, there was a not just a debate, there was a scandal between the papacy and the leaders of the Holy Roman Empire. And and it was all about who has the authority to invest, to appoint bishops. Spiritually, this is the authority that only the successors of St. Peter had. But practically, it may make more sense when the Pope is not just Bishop of Rome, when the Pope is not just, successor of St. Peter, but when the Pope is a lord in his own right and controls estates and has lots of political prominence and responsibilities as well. Does it make sense for an Italian aristocrat to make decisions in your own principality or region? So there was a lot of pushback to the papacy during this period of time. And there was one emperor who really was at loggerheads with Pope Gregory the Seventh, if I'm getting the Pope right, and started accusing him of all sorts of vile things, like absolutely vile, like even murder. Like you obtained your position by climbing the ranks and getting rid of your enemies, and just the most horrific of actions. But one of the most, I mean, I'm going to say impressive criticisms by this emperor was, I thought you were a monk. I thought you were a monk. And I think Gregory the Seventh was originally a Cluniac, or I mean,
Hmm.
some Reformed Benedictine monk. Well, as a monk, the whole process is through obedience. You develop humility, and by embracing humility, you will overcome the worst of all, the vices, and that is pride. Responsible for the downfall of our of humans, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, a monk's whole life is to cultivate the virtue of humility.
Hmm.
Any so now I'm going back on recent popes. I'm trying to think. I hope none of them recently were monks. A monk should
Leo's
not
the
be a
first one
pope.
in a
I
while.
mean,
Yeah.
just by vocation, it's a very good argument. You should not be. And actually, no abbot of a monastery wants to be abbot of a monastery. In fact, I've seen enough and I've done enough study on this that that n- all abbots are reluctant abbots. All and I'd love to think all prelates, all people in positions of power, especially in the church, I am hoping are reluctant. I hope none of them are eager and zealous to, exert authority.
The
Um,
best
you know,
ones. The best ones are, at least.
yeah, it means my hope. Um, but no, this notion of a powerful pontiff, of that this is a position, that you know we expect people we and even with recent papacies, like Pope Francis's papacy, where definitely there's different, I won't call them terrorisms, but you know there's definite emphases that are placed on popes pontificates. And you know humility was something Pope Francis, whether you agree or not, but this was definitely an emphasis. And so I've probably gotten off track, but I did kind of see a connection to a few historical medieval events in history. But ultimately, I guess the point I was getting across is the the humans who occupy this position. That's something that's very front and center in medieval history.
Hmm.
They are presented as not superhuman at all. In fact, history doesn't remember them that way. I think we have an expectation nowadays that they are absolutely superhuman, and that when we watch them in real time, even I'm guilty. I had pipes with a few colleagues, um, and I don't know, something about smoking a pipe, and we're talking about the papacy, and this was just after the election of Pope Leo. And I was happy to say that I teach Latin, that I didn't have to wait for the translation.
Right.
No, no, oh, he's taken the name Leo, and I got that 3 whole seconds before everybody else. Um, but I remember talking to some of my colleagues and friends around a fire. We're smoking pipes, um, and I remember being critical to this is literally a month after the election. And I said, "I'm telling you, I'm not all that happy." And they're like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "I was hoping for someone to come out swinging. I wanted to let's go." And my big criticism was, I don't have a feel for Pope Leo. I don't know, what is Pope Leo about. What's good. This is a month
Hmm.
into the papacy, and here I am expecting to know what the priorities are going to be. Oh, is he the AI Pope? Is he going to be I mean, it's almost ridiculous where we want information so quickly, and that we almost expect to be consulted, and
Yeah, right. Yeah.
we expect to have a say in the matter, even. And that if a pope is in some way, not acting as a pope, well, from the medieval perspective, maybe we don't want everything that implies, acting like a pope. Well, there's plenty of ways a pope acts, but ultimately, it's what a pope teaches and preaches, and how a pope leads, that's important. There's plenty of things, we don't have time to go into how popes acted in the Middle Ages. Um, that's definitely maybe another topic.
Yeah.
Uh,
In the actual Dark Ages. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, no, I think the papacy, there are lows and there are highs, but as you said, the church comes around under the leadership of these individuals, and I think every pope um, you know, mostly leave something that is important and, valuable, and that this is an institution that's clearly guided by, providence. So, um,
Hmm. Yeah, despite our best efforts. Well, and maybe, and
that's
yeah,
very well put. Very well put.
and maybe that's a good yeah, place to end that topic, but then also to segue into the next one, because the I think that's a helpful connection to remember. I mean, and that's actually honestly largely what one of my overarching goals for the Popecast is to help us chill out a little bit about modern society. It seems like there's all these problems. It's nothing new. They've happened 17 million times before. Even in the best cases, there was something going wrong somewhere else in Christendom, like some part of Christendom, of the wider world, was having some sort of uproar, even in the best of times.
Hmm. Yep.
Um, but on the personal side of things, I think it's always helpful to know that maybe all of these the cottage industry of pious looking saints in the 50s and 60s, the books that were developed, and people had these chiseled jawlines, and you know these pious flowery tales of saints of old, and there was no, like you said, there's no real room for the humanity of it, which I think there's a place for that. I think that can be helpful, but more helpful as we mature and think, I really suck at being a Christian, as being a husband, as being a father, as being a whatever. Um, to understand that everybody has that same
Right.
insecurity, I guess, if you want to call it that,
What is?
including
Yeah.
yeah, including everybody who lived in every century in the past, and also including like senses of humor. I remember thinking like 10 or 12 years ago that, or it occurring to me that just because everybody looked really grouchy in the first photographs that were ever taken didn't mean that they didn't have senses of humor. They just
Yes.
had to sit there and look
Yeah.
pissed
Hmm.
because the pictures took so long or whatever. But so the sense of humor part, I think,
Yeah.
is a good segue into what, aside from maybe listeners who have had you as a professor and know you elsewhere, but
Right.
people who recognize your name um, as Medievalist Matt on Instagram. Maybe you can give a just an overview of how you've gotten so popular, and maybe so maybe I can just preface it a little bit. So you'll, I think, on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a day, memes from a little
To
picture from
to
a little
my
manuscript.
children, absolute horror. Sometimes multiple times a day. Yeah.
I can imagine. So yeah, what's the overview, the creative process, not to make it bigger than it needs to be or something, but I have been endlessly entertained by it
Huh.
for several years now, I think.
Well, I mean, thank you for saying that, for saying that. And I'll take the compliment. I'm embarrassed in for a lot of reasons about the account. I mean, I'm somewhat proud. I'll say at the same time. There are things that I really am proud of, and there are things that I honestly, just like my children, cringe at. Um,
Right?
the stuff I'm proud of, by the way, always falls flat. Oh, I mean, really,
Naturally.
the ones I'm like, this is gold, guys. Come on, this is, and I know it is. I know it is because there's a little Gary Larson in here, like the Far
Yes.
Side,
Yes.
or there's a little. But I mean, I have my influences too. Um, yeah. So the genesis of this whole project was simply, and it was done under just like just like abbots and popes, and my expectations for all people in positions of authority. You should do it reluctantly. Well, I did Instagram reluctantly because I remember being at a faculty development seminar, which I loathed in general. I mean, I'm like, oh, another meeting. And in this meeting, they're going to tell me how I'm not being a professor properly, and that I should be doing this instead of this, and that no, you shouldn't use chalk, or you have
Oh
to
my
adopt
gosh. Yeah.
this, or Anyways, um, well, this faculty development was on. Get this. This is how old it was. I think it was the Millennial Mind. Now, you might
Oh
even
my
be a
gosh.
millennial. I'm looking at you. You're a
Yep.
millennial. I'm Gen X. It might have been about millennials and just how to understand this new strange generation that are starting to enter our classrooms. And they brought up this thing called social media. And and they said it's really important that we engage with students both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And I'm here rolling my eyes. I'm like,
Hmm.
why, you're not paying me to be a professor 24/7, but no, that was
Right.
the intention of this. But it really was to stay connected with students over the summer. There's there's plenty of time professors are not in the classroom, so that potentially could be time for you to connect. And at an institution like Ohio Dominican, where we are tuition driven, and we want as much enrollment as we can, and we absolutely have to retain every single student that walks through this doors. We don't want to lose. And we want to just excite them. We want to be dynamic. Well, social media might be one of these ways. And I'm like, oh, you're kidding me. What am I supposed to do on social media? And so I created an account, and I guess one of the most serendipitous things is I didn't call my account Ohio Dominican History Department. Because if I called it Ohio Dominican History Department, I'm not
Yeah.
saying I'm not proud of my department, but might not have grown as much beyond the institution, anyways. So I just came up with a stupid name, and I decided, I'll just do like history fact of the day stuff. I'll do history in the news, medieval stuff. I'll do, a new medieval movie's coming out. Maybe I'll do a review, Game of Thrones, that type of thing. And I did it, and it was, when I say it was well received by maybe 5 students of mine in my classrooms that just had a lot of sympathy and pity over what I'm trying to do. So they would like it, you know. Um, and but every so often I'd see this newfangled thing called a meme. And believe it or not, even saying that word right now, it seems like it's an artifact. Like even a meme, I'm not saying memes are on their way out. I think there's always going to be a vehicle for humor, and hopefully something that is remotely intelligent or touches on being intelligent. Who knows what it's going to look like? But there was this thing called a meme, and I saw one. I can't tell you which one it was. And I said, oh, just like the ninth century intellectuals, I could just substitute this word for this, or I could just sub that out, put some medieval, or this is a Roman history meme. I'll just do that to the Middle Ages. So I did that, and all of a sudden the like count just, quadrupled, or tenfold, 20-fold,
Hmm.
100-fold. I'm like, oh, people kind of like that. And so I made a few more. And then over time, the history fact of the day stuff, the actual somewhat serious stuff, kind of was replaced by exclusively my pitiful attempts at humor. Every day I wake up, I'd like to say I give myself an hour to sift through manuscripts and images and memes, waiting for the muse, waiting to be inspired. Sometimes it takes a little longer. Sometimes it's not just in the morning, but it's at other times as well. Um, So yeah, so I try to do one a day. Sometimes it's three. It's if it hits me, I made a rule early on. Just don't second guess. I trust my intuition. I imagine everything I post, my worst enemy is going to see and try to use against me. So I'm not saying I'm not prudent.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're a little what's the word? Um uh I'm not saying they're controversial and never sacrilegious, because I'm very I kind of do have ground rules.
Sure. Yeah.
I hope some people see that in no ways I might have somebody wearing a halo in one of my pictures. This might be a saint. It might be, the Virgin Mary even. The humor is in no way about denigrating, you know, uh, uh, you know, uh, one of these, champions of our faith. It's look at what this monk has done. Like look at,
Right.
I'm pretty sure that saint's, ears weren't that big or whatever it was. So yeah, I sit around and I just wait for something to come to my mind. I slap a caption on it and I post it. I don't hold on to anything. I used to try to pace myself. Oh, I don't want to wake up tomorrow and not have an idea. That never works, because the more I sit on something, the more I just scrutinize it to death and then I just end up ruining it. So at any rate, that's kind of the account. I do, I find that I it's very easy to use this medium. The people who were illustrating, and my own preparation, my own background. I'm a text person. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
I'm a medieval Latin person. I want to read the text. So this you know social media endeavor of mine has made me have to kind of broaden my mindset, actually learn about a few things, because there are certain elements in art history that are very serious, and there's a lot of meaning to this. And so I've had to learn a lot about my subject matter, just so I know what I can post, what I should maybe hold off on, or rework. So that's kind of the story of the account. It's a very random enterprise, but for the most part, it was intended for students. It then became a creative outlet, and it remains a creative outlet. This is so I don't inflict it on my family. So I hope my wife and kids are at least happy that they're not getting the brunt of this, you know, type of humor. And thirdly, now it's almost become, you know, meaningful in that it allows me to kind of challenge people's preconceptions about the Middle Ages, about the darkness of the world.
Mm-hmm.
One type of humor I do not like, that social media is just rife with, is this existential dread that this life is meaningless and the world is just going to hell, and there is just, humans are the worst and we're a plague on the world and we're a parasite. And I am just so opposed to this sort of humor. I'm not trying to make everything just vanilla and nice and sweet and wholesome and cute, because not a lot of my humor is runs that direction. I
Mm-hmm.
love being irreverent. Um, but I want to counter that. I mean, the world, if I could show that the dark ages, were hardly as dark as we think they were. Maybe when we look at it at our own times, we should be a little more positive and reassured that, you know, we're not doing much differently, first of all, and that we're actually handling a good amount of things well. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. In a much smaller, much less consistent way. I've seen similar things on, like, I'll post something irreverent, like a little meme, and then there'll be people in the comments, how dare you make, laugh at this thing? How dare you make fun of, well, it's not making fun of the Pope, or how dare
right.
you make light of, I don't even remember. I can't even think of an example, but it's almost the horseshoe graph was the other thing I thought of, where on one end you have the people with existential dread who find no meaning in anything and they make fun of
Hmm.
everything.
Right.
On the other extreme, you have the people that are so serious about the thing, including all the things you don't have to be serious about. And then in the middle, hopefully you have the people who, as again, to quote Chesterton, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly.
I agree with that. We're all so different, and the thing is, I don't think I should be in the committee room, where everyone's talking about serious things. I think people need to play to their strengths, but also allow for the fact that we have different talents. There was there's something called the medieval temperaments. That we all have different characters and personalities, and I tend to be very extroverted and sanguine, and my son may be a little more choleric, or phlegmatic, or whatever, all the different temperaments. Well, there was a question: which one was Jesus? Which one was Jesus? And of course, the the inevitable answer is, well, Jesus was a combination, so perfectly measured of all four, that, even Jesus, was of course absolutely serious. And of course, I mean, I don't know if you could talk about the piety of Jesus, I mean, the piety of God. Um, but Jesus with his friends, most certainly would have laughed, and most certainly, you know, um, would not have only been one way. And even talking about the saints and photographs of from 100 years ago, everyone's so serious. I think everybody in the 80s, I'm talking about Gen X people now, maybe in the 90s, but I had my Catholic Book of Saints. And I have burned into my memory how every single saint looked on every single page. And I had my favorite saint, Saint Sebastian, of course, because that was the bloody arrows, etc.
Oh yeah.
Of course, I knew Saint Matthew because Saint Matthew was my namesake, or am I his? No, thank you. Yeah,
There it
you
is.
know what I mean. I have these saints burned in my mind, and of course, yes, a lot of them are most remembered for their great deeds and their their kind of their, how they acted as champions of the faith. Um, but what I like my saints human too. I maybe I'll be a champion of the faith. Maybe that's in God's plans for me, but um I fully expect to do things in a much lesser way than some of the most notable ones. I want my saints to be relatable. I want my saints to be human. I want my saints to have something I could latch onto and then bring me up. Um, so that's why Saint Augustine's always everybody's favorite go-to for that reason. But even
Hmm.
Thomas Aquinas, some of my best friends are Thomists, and they're absolutely brilliant, and I appreciate Thomism so much, even though the majority of it is just over my head. But Thomas Aquinas was sensitive, and Thomas Aquinas was had a sense of humor. We tend to forget that. So yeah, the medieval the illustrators, a lot of them were monks, a lot of them had senses of humor, a lot of them were playful, but a lot of them were cutting and satirical as well. There were problems in the church, when you depict the pope as as a swine, with the bishop's mitre,
Yeah.
maybe you're saying something about
Hmm.
gluttony and excess and hypocrisy. It's done in a playful, amusing way, but this is a challenge as well, and sometimes that's very appropriate and important. Yeah, we have this material. um, I think it's important to understand exactly where the humor lies here and what its purpose is. And it's hard, especially with social media. You can't get in other people's minds, and no one really is going to understand your intent. And That's why I do have several filters. It lasts all of 30 seconds. When I post something, I really do go through a bunch of filters, and I'm like, how is this going to be taken? And I run the gamut. I kind of
Hmm.
say, how are the if you're rad trad, how are you going to view it? If you're liberal, if you're progressive, if you're pagan, if you're agnostic, whatever you are, how is this going to be understood? In the end, I hope though that they're understood positively, that they reflect well on humanity, and
Hmm.
our place here on earth, um, and that they honestly make people's day a little brighter. That's in the end, that's kind of what the very kind of benign intent of the account is.
Yeah. Well, I know certainly for me, and clearly, given its popularity, it's been the case for tons more people. So that's at Medievalist Matt on Instagram, and I think that's probably. I know we've sorry, we've got a little bit, quite a bit longer than we had initially planned, but I
Oh yeah, no,
appreciate
no,
your
no. Yeah.
taking the time. Is
Yeah.
there anything else? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no, I was gonna say, um, Instagram's funny. Instagram's always sending me these AI messages. You should do this with your account. You should do this with your account. So their latest one was, and this I feel like I'm walking backwards in time.
Hmm.
I have a Facebook account that that essentially my wife runs because she tags me on everything, and my
Mhm.
wife is the archivist of the family. She is the journalist of the family. She is the communicator of the family, and I'm just along for the ride. And my wife does a great job. She tags my personal account, but but Facebook, or excuse me, Instagram has been like, you need to, because they own everything, right? Like the
Mhm.
Meta, you need to get this on Facebook. I'm like, whatever, just stop bothering me with it. So believe it or not, if you're not on Instagram, it actually, I think I have like 4 people on Facebook right now. So it could also be found there, but it's like such a
Okay.
recent development. And to me, Facebook is kind of, I'm not saying it's old technology because I still use it, but I use it for meaningful personal connections. And
Right. Yeah.
my connections on Instagram can be meaningful, um, depending on with whom it is. But so yes, but it's primarily it's Instagram and
Mhm.
and Twitter or X. That's just a, when I say it's a dark place, there's lots of good stuff going on there. But wow, I just, but I don't think my stuff it's just not a good vehicle for the medieval memes for some reason.
No, I
So
don't think yeah.
so
They'd burn it
yeah.
all down before you even got started or something probably on X,
And
yeah.
and the other thing I will say, and I know we've gone on and on and on, is um, this account was started to connect me with other people, and lamentably, I can no longer really respond to messages
Mhm.
um, on Instagram, and I only rarely even look because I can't choose to respond to one and then not respond to others. But I'm so very rarely even in the comments, just because it's not the primary thing I'm doing. But I
Mhm.
do encourage people to contact me if they want to contact me. But yeah, gotta do it the most traditional way possible. And traditional in our day and age is email. So people can find my email on the account. But yeah, if people wanted to talk about anything, or if they had something, they said, "Oh, you mentioned this. You got this date wrong." Um, you know, if yeah, there's 3 or 4 of them, and they all can't be right. So, but people are anyone is welcome to contact me. I'm happy to have back and forths on email. I really encourage it. So,
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a good example of that. I kinda took a flyer just because I have, like I said, followed you for a while and
yeah.
would have loved to have had you on the podcast, and I was shocked when you, replied back because I know you probably get a ton,
Well,
so
I've always lurked on your account only because I am, when you have something so niche, I'm just curious, like, how is this, how is this managed? How is this curated? And you do such a good job with it.
Oh,
And
thank
and
you.
and you're, when I say you're more committed, like, your material is not that it's narrow. It's broad in one sense, but it's focused on a very specialized topic. And so I kind of, relate to that in a lot of ways, but admire it even more because for you to take this focus and communicate it effectively with a modern audience is, it's a phenomenal undertaking. And so I really, really admire it. So I've always been checking in on what
Oh,
you're doing, which is why, yeah, when I got your message, I'm like, oh, what's going on? So yeah, I'm very flattered, and honored that you thought that I'd have something worthwhile to say,
oh, thanks.
for this chat. So hopefully there's a little bit that's valuable, but if people are welcome to contact me, but I really enjoyed our conversation.
Good. Yeah, well, likewise, I really appreciate you saying that as well because, one, we talk about the imperfection of the human condition. I constantly feel like I could be doing so much more and doing better, and the temptation is so real, and I'm sure you probably feel the same thing. The temptation is real to go outside of the niche, so to speak, in order to whatever, grow
Yeah,
more followers, get, you know, varying listeners or something, but at the end of the day, it would just be cheapened, um, to go outside because there's those kind of accounts are a dime a dozen, and,
right,
however big the Lord wants the Popecast and Medievalist Matt to get, it will get,
right,
and, everything else is not important.
right. Exactly, exactly. Well, I'd like to think there are some brighter areas kind of in social media and the fact that they're out there is reassuring. So keep
Yeah.
on doing what you're doing. No, I'm a big fan. So, and
Yeah.
thank you for
Good.
having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for taking the time. And yeah, maybe we'll reconnect for that bonus episode
Absolutely.
on philology for 3 hours or something.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I look forward to that one.